Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Thank you, Tom, for a great conference today. Today, I'm going to be kind of shifting what we've talked about in the last few sessions to looking at geoarchaeology. So I'm new here at UCSD, and I'm a geoarchaeologist. And I really want to do a different kind of picture here because I'm talking about the people and the nomads that we've kind of looked over so far in this session. So I'm going to be looking at kind of the geoarchaeology of nomads and its kind of implications about future research that we can do. Can everyone hear me? Am I standing close enough? Okay. So we'll start it with just kind of one quick picture of Tom. And Tom asked me, he said, Zach, would you like to speak at our Exodus conference? And I was like, absolutely. But you can see in my face here, I have a kind of awkward smile going on. I was like, but I'm a geoarchaeologist and I don't really study the Exodus. And Tom was like, but you study nomads. What can we talk about then as nomads that would be broadly applicable? And indeed, the archaeology of ancient nomads has been continuing basically. I mean, Tom did some of the earliest stuff in this kind of region, maybe not earliest, but some of the most important stuff starting in the 1970s. And we can look at different groups, and archaeology of ancient nomads and also modern nomads has really kind of exploded. Here are three different pictures of Wadi Firan in Sinai, in Mongolia, and also Maasai. And many of these have become kind of the study of geoarchaeology because in general, it is very difficult to identify nomadic people. How do we identify where they are? Especially, how do we identify what kind of nomads these people are? And how can we correlate human activity with time? And this is where geoarchaeology can come in and give us a picture. If we go back 30 years, right, there's this idea that nomads are invisible. The reason we can't find evidence of the Exodus is because we can't see them. They're not in one place long enough. In fact, Finkelstein and Perevlotsky in 1990 said basically that nomads leave no trace, that they're not there, but they don't leave a trace in the archaeological record. This is big for those of you that know kind of the idea about nomadism and monarchy, right? We don't see the beginning of the Israelites until we have the settlement of people in certain places. Now, there were critiques very kind of early on also by Rosen, who said that we can see them in archaeology, but indeed it is difficult to see them. And how can we look then for nomads in archaeology? So throughout the 2000s or 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, we have this wave of ethnoarchaeology that really does define what can we possibly see. So we get big stuff, a lot of it from Wadi Firan, where we get comparative site plans and structure. We can understand what ephemeral sites look like. We can get idea about context. What kind of objects do we expect to find, or the distribution of objects and artifacts? We also get comparative demographies. How many people? How intensive are these occupations? We have to think about this with nomads throughout history about how long, because how long determines what signature you leave on the archaeological record. We also get comparative assemblages. We have lithics and ceramics, and we kind of get an idea, at least in the Negev, also in Jordan, somewhat in Sinai, where we can understand the patterns of archaeological evidence that can give us an indication that these people are actually nomads or they're other groups of people. Now, that sounds really easy, but I want to show a picture of what an archaeological nomadic site looks like. Now, some of us that work in the desert, this looks like a site. Some of us, maybe it doesn't. And if I was asking you guys a question, what kind of activities do you see here? We have some dark patches here, probably some ash remains, but what is really remaining here and what can we define here? So temporary encampments are really limited in deposition, and they make it actually a really hard place for us to do archaeology. So geoarchaeology, this is where I can come in and give a bigger picture for this. This is the application of geosciences on a micro scale. I should have put this as micro geoarchaeology. What can we identify from the micro scale to reconstruct things about nomadic activity, time periods what are they doing at these sites? So this is where I can come in and talk about what we can do. Now, what is the foundation of geoarchaeology? Well, it's actually geoethnoarchaeology. We can't avoid living people to understand the past. Now, we can't say that what is going on today in a modern Bedouin village looks exactly the same as it did 3,000 years ago, but they can give some kind of image about what impact and what activities are preserved in the sediments that we are excavating. So this is something we can look at. And we can look at things like what is like a small nomadic encampment. This is actually a Bedouin that worked with us at Mashabe Sadeh, who helped actually guard our site and helped us define the sites. And this is a very small temporary encampment. We're actually encamping within an archaeological site. We can also look at how this puts a picture or how this changes the landscape. Something that has kind of not really been kind of explored, at least that I have seen today, is how much of the landscape in both Sinai and Negev are completely anthropogenic. We've changed these landscapes through thousands of years of pastoral activity. This is something that is actually deposited in the chemical composition of the wadis themselves and the biota and etc. And we can also look at what it looks like at a tent level or if we want to go and historical wise, what does it look like before we have tents? What are people living like in different types of settlements and encampments in the Negev or Sinai in the past? And we can look at that through many different ways. Geoethnoarchaeology gives us kind of a wide battery of things and techniques to be able to look at the past and reconstruct something. So I have two very common examples that we can easily do. One is we can look at fireplaces. This is going to be a picture on the left. Let's see if I don't mess this up. Laser pointer here. We can get characteristic pictures. Now on the surface, this looks like almost nothing. But when we look at it underneath the microscope, we can actually identify what this is. We can even identify how often it is reused. Is this a communal fireplace? Is this some kind of place where constant activity is happening? What are they cooking? What are they doing in these places? These are all things we can reconstruct with microgeoarchaeology. And important for us as people looking for pastoral nomads, we can also look at things like this. I showed this little picture here. Hopefully you guys can kind of see where I'm going. This is actually a dung pellet. This is a sheep and goat dung pellet that is actually preserved in an archaeological site, Wadi Mustayar. This is actually a site from the the Byzantine/early Islamic period. So we can have really good preservation that this is what we can identify. And this looks exactly the same in the past as it does in the modern era. So these are ways we can get something that I like to call fingerprinting activities. We can use archaeological sciences to fingerprint activities and depositional processes to reconstruct what we're seeing in archaeological sites. And if we want to find nomads and understand how they're interacting with a landscape, this is where we can go. Now, in particular, and if any of you looked me up on the internet before this to be like, who is Zach Dunseth and what will he talk about? You probably saw that I also often talk about dung. Dung is a really important thing in pastoral nomads, and it is a wealth of information that we can get about the past. If we can identify dung in an archaeological site, we can reconstruct paleo environment. We can reconstruct seasonality of when these people were there. We can look at what kind of fuels they're using. Are they impacting the landscape? Are they using dung fuels? Are we looking at different factors of pastoralism or agropastoralism, which is going to change our concept about how nomads are living in certain places? And then, of course, we can look on the local scale and look at activity areas and site structure. How were these places organized? How were sites organized in the past? Luckily for us, working in the Middle East, sheep and goat are great producers of a very indicative thing called a dung spherulite. Underneath the microscope, they look like little small circles with crosses in them. And they're really impactful because they're one of the few direct and easily preservable in these dry environments of dung in an area. So if I find lots of this, I can reasonably assume that there were large amounts of animals in this area, specifically ruminants, sheep, goats, dung, or sheep, goats, and then I can use this material to reconstruct these other types of things like seasonality, paleo environment, etc. And just to kind of give a quick background, we know that they form in the guts of ruminants. So they're partly, we don't really know how they're formed. Probably you guys have all heard about the microbiome. This seems to be an important factor. It may be a defense mechanism actually. Has anyone here had kidney stones? Unfortunately, I suffer from them. It's a family trait that luckily I inherited. But the one thing that essentially it seems that there's something in the goat and sheep microbiome where they can eat calcium-rich plants and they do not form what becomes calcium oxalates, which end up being kidney stones. So these are things that seem to be adaptive for certain environments. And we also know that they don't show up in certain types of animals. So for example, we can get an idea about the age structure of this because they don't form in young animals. We don't really know why, probably because their microbiome hasn't fluoresced enough. We also know that, for example, they don't often show up in vaccinated animals. So if you go to a petting zoo where they have lots of animals, these do not form the same kind of dung spherulites. They seem to be very indicative. Now, if I can identify dung in a certain site, I can look at it and find out what other features are in there. And one of the most important ones for me working in the desert is looking at phytoliths. Phytoliths are small opal biominerals that form in plants. And because they're really well preserved, they can actually preserve the taxonomic qualities of what plants were eaten by animals in the past. Now, we might not get a single meal, but we can get an averaging of meal. And important for us and important for my research in looking at desert agriculture is we can very clearly identify specific cultivated species like the one on the left versus wild species. One more looks like a neuron, if anyone here is a brain scientist, and one kind of looks like a bunch of waves. So these are very easy ways we can use, oh, this doesn't work, microarchaeology to reconstruct aspects about pastoral nomadism life. We can also look at seasonality because rate of phytoliths change. I won't go into everything here, but essentially we have a very drastic change between summer species and winter species because grasses produce much more phytoliths. So we can see a clear seasonal change in the material. We can also differentiate between different types of sites. For example, we can look at sites that are living kind of completely pure pastoralism or groups that are doing some kind of agropastoral or full agricultural activities just through the phytolith concentrations. And finally, looking at the actual phytoliths themselves, if we can identify dung, we can get indications of their consumption of wild plants or their consumption of wild plants and cereals. And we've used this in many different transdisciplinary studies. I originally put this as interdisciplinary studies, but transdisciplinary seems to be the word of the day. And really kind of fascinating when you start connecting this microgeoarchaeology with people who study botanical remains, we can make really amazing references. So one, I did a study at Shivta. This is a Byzantine early Islamic site. And we were able to kind of trace out what the dung record, what kind of, if you want to put it in a catchment area, of where this is recording the environment around. And we could show that it was about about up to 50 kilometers of an area of what it's recording. We could also get a seasonality from the pollen and the different seeds, and we could actually chart exactly when the most likely time when most of the dung pellets were dropped, if you will, and this would have been in March and April at this site, which is quite amazing if I can reconstruct a season from 2000, about 1,500 years ago. So case study, I'll give you guys a quick case study. And this is a site that I worked on basically for the past 12 years, a few different sites. These are intermediate Bronze Age sites from the Negev. And the intermediate Bronze Age is about 2500 to 1950. I'm not really connecting this to the Exodus story, although it has been done in the past. But importantly, for my research, I was very interested in looking at why do we have this peak of activity during the intermediate Bronze Age. To put this in kind of the greater context, this is the collapse of the Old Kingdom. We can put that in the geopolitical context there. We can see this is the kind of the collapse of the urban situation in the north. Essentially any of the urban sites, Megiddo, for example, any of the EB3 sites that dissolve, they all go away, and we have an increase of sites in the Negev during this time. For a long time, we had tons of information based on survey, and you can see that there's kind of an ebb and flow, a settlement oscillations over time. And in particular, we're looking at this period here. Why do we go from a period basically that's 0 sites, we have no evidence, to an explosion where we have more sites until the Byzantine period? about 1,000 years later. We have more than the Iron Age. We always talk about the Iron Age being all exciting. We have more sites during the Intermediate Bronze Age than we do in this period. So I came to this research looking at why is this happening at this time? Now, I did many different things. I'm not going to leave this up very long, but I did micromorphology, elemental analysis, phytoliths, Dunstferrilites. We also did radiocarbon OSL, and I did also spatial analysis of artifacts themselves. I don't think you should be doing micro-geoarchaeology without also doing archaeology. This is a very important aspect of both sides. And I looked at two different types of sites, and this is a good photo because it shows two pictures of intermediate Bronze Age sites. Now, they might be kind of hard to see, but some of them are quite large. To put this in scale, this is about 200 square meters, I believe about 20 hectares, or dunams. I always am forgetting which number I'm using wrong. And the idea was that I'm looking here at a site like this versus small sites like these. I want you to ignore this. This is a later site that we actually investigated and turned out to be Iron Age, not irrelevant for our current discussion here. So my question here coming in is I had many research questions. One, are these contemporaneous? We now know the pottery is coming from them, but now that we have a 500-year period where we have to understand, are these the same time? We know there's lots of copper, ingots and things, all of them actually found at the sites that Tom has excavated, like Khirbet. What was that? With Muhammad. In Khirbet Hamreif Dan, and there are tons of them found at sites like these. So are they connected to copper production was the question. Do we have connections to Egypt or the Arava? Can we see this through movement of ceramics or goods or some other things? So I came here looking at these kind of big questions, and I almost forgot the most important one. Also, how are people living? How do you suddenly get a site like this pop up where you have 200 structures roughly contemporaneous with itself that are showing up kind of en masse versus these ones which seem to be more kind of connected to the natural populations in the desert? So I did a transect of the region. I looked at 4 different sites. Mashabe Sadeh and Enzik were 2 large sites like the picture I just showed you, and 2 smaller sites, kind of characteristic of this kind of smaller pastoral nomadism, or at least what I assumed was pastoral nomadism. Also, I wanted to get a clear kind of cross-section of precipitation across this area. So I looked at a range of areas from 80 to 150 millimeters. Note these are all below the level, essentially, of what we consider normal cereal agriculture, but you can still have cereal agriculture at about 150 to 180 on a very small scale. Now, the first thing I wanted to do was make sure how do these fit in time? And what we found is essentially we have many contemporaneous sites. So I have 3 sites here that I'm showing, Nahal Boker, Enzik, and Nahal Nitzana, and all of them are contemporaneous to the most part, although Nahal Boker has 2 kind of periods of time, both EB3 and IBA. So the sites themselves are contemporaneous. They're existing roughly in the same picture. If we extrapolate this, along with all of the other published radiocarbon dates in the Negev, we actually see that the survey data is problematic. And what we've been expecting is this sudden drop between sites changes to a clear trajectory where we're going up in number of sites over time. So instead of an up and down movement between the EB2 to the IBA, we don't have a gap of settlement. And this kind of changes our perspective. If we want to connect this back to ideas about the Exodus, we could expect the Exodus in something like this, where we have sudden influx of people. Here, we do not have an influx of people entering the site. If we take it kind of also and look at the chronology, this connects also exactly when essentially all the sites date to the end of the Egyptian Old Kingdom and all kind of ended roughly around the same time. So moving on to the sites themselves, if I wanted to reconstruct how people are living, one of the first things I wanted to look is for this dung. If dung is such a rich resource, can I identify aspects about life at these sites? And the first 2 sites I looked at over 111 samples. I want to also put this in perspective of effort. Each sample takes me about 4 to 8 hours to analyze. So we're talking hundreds of hours of analysis manually, and I found essentially no dung anywhere. And this was surprising to me. No other site, if you look at anything in the ancient Near East, will you not find large amounts of animal dung. There's no place where you're not finding animals around. I honestly came here thinking that this would be the baseline and how I would compare to places with it in a different way. So if you see this line here, this is essentially the line of what it looks like off-site to the site, the level of dung. Essentially, there's no evidence of extra dung in any of these areas. So weirdly, we have this picture where we have no dung, no living domesticated animals. We do have dead animals coming to the site, but only meat-bearing parts. So they're being provisioned in some way. We also had from geochem, no copper production is happening at these sites, and no phytoliths related to cultivated cereals. So they're not growing. These large sites are not the first instance of farming in the Negev, for example. Looking at material culture, we can just see a quick picture. I won't kind of go through everything here, but we have mainly storage vessels, ingots, copper ingots that we're finding, and copper scrap, and also faunal remains from meat-bearing parts. If I look at smaller sites, we have the exact opposite picture. Instead of having no evidence of dung, I have an insane amount of dung. If I put this brown here, we can clearly see it's on almost every area that I excavated at this site. And to put this, I should have put a scale, but where am I in this photo? This is me. That is my head. It's quite a large site, so this is a large site where I found dung everywhere. And dung into the level that if I went and excavated a modern Bedouin village, this is the same kind of preservation of dung that I find there. So it is a really good indicator, even in a site that dates to about 3000 BCE. So this is a powerful tool that we can use. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't just kind of doing large kind of pictures, and I actually did a small scale thing on a much smaller site, meter by meter, sampling in this small area 80 different samples. And I found the same picture, but interestingly, only certain areas are being holding animals. Not crazy, right? If we think about how ethnography works. And other places are completely absent of dung. So here, different picture. Living domesticates, phytoliths without evidence of cultivation, and again, no copper production at these sites. I won't go so much into this, but we have a very different kind of ceramic assemblage as well. Dominance of cooking vessels versus storage vessels. If I pull all of this picture together, we have kind of two very different pictures. We have one that is clearly a group subsisting on trade and a group that is subsisting on pastoralism. And this is all coming from a combination of mixing macro and microarchaeology together. So this kind of comes together and we were like, okay, then we have all this copper at these large sites. Where does it go? Is it going to Egypt? Is it going somewhere else? Recent evidence is showing that maybe it's not going to Egypt, or only a small amount of it is. And it seems to be going instead to Syria. We also have, and since the last few years, we have interesting identifications, and maybe Emmanuel Anati will also talk about these a little bit, where we have these interesting crescent-headed figures. These have been identified as being local to all these intermediate Bronze Age sites. They're very interesting. They're very unusual. They have these, as they call, crescent-headed, and they have a characteristic knife with them, and often a recurved bow as well. And these happen to be located next to many of the intermediate Bronze Age sites, but their iconography is very weird and doesn't fit. So interestingly, we for a long time thought that copper is going from Fainan to Egypt. Maybe some of it's going here, but we also have, for some reason, non-local, possibly Mesopotamian or Yemeni parallels to these iconographic instances. Just another photo. So if we come to back to the kind of research questions at the beginning, looking at these two different sites, we have no evidence of farming. We have no evidence of copper production, and we don't really have any evidence of permanent desert settlement. I didn't show, but the phytoliths also show these are seasonal occupations here. We also found at the smaller sites, we have seasonal nomadic pastoralism, where we clearly have lots of animals being left there. They are not growing food, and this seems to be a kind of consistent subsistence strategy that is common throughout time. Finally, what is the next steps? If we want to go in the future and look at nomadism, what is the next step? And I want to do, and what I'm trying to start a project to do, is looking at, can we take the animal bones we found at these sites and start doing stable isotope analysis? Can we identify where these animals are raised and how they end up to these sites? Very interestingly, at a site Tel Safi, we have found that especially draft animals are being raised and bred in Egypt, sacrificed at Tel Safi, which, to put it in perspective, it's roughly here to Tel Safi Gath here. So we have interesting kind of pieces of information that will be exciting to look at in the future. And finally, I have 4 minutes left, so I will promise I'll finish on time. We have interesting things where we can start looking at ancient DNA. And this is a project that I'm currently working on with Daniel Fuchs from Ben Gurion University, where we're trying to do proteomics and ancient DNA from intact dung pellets, to use this to reconstruct environment, reconstruct movement, and reconstruct interactions with people in the environment. If you want to talk about this later, I'm happy to talk after the talk. So implications for Exodus research. I think these are ways, if you want to identify actual people who are part of the Exodus, if we want to find them somewhere, we need to be involving geoarchaeology as an essential toolkit. And I want to kind of use this as a propaganda piece to say people should be starting to look at this if we want to identify them in the archaeological record. And on that note, I will end this talk. I will say thank you very much to Tom for inviting me here. Also, thank you to my advisors, Rudy Shah-Gross and Israel Finkelstein, who you will see tomorrow on Zoom. And also, thank you all for waiting for me, and let's go get a drink. Tom.
Zach, that was a great talk. And there's so much potential here for UCSD. Thank you. I was wondering about the big site you showed was Mishabeh Sadeh, I think?
Mishabeh Sadeh, yeah.
Yeah, and Rudolf Cohen excavated it. He in the 70s and the 80s, and he kind of stripped the place.
He did.
Right? So did he remove like the juicy deposits where you might find all the things that are absent today?
So I'll say that he excavated at that site, he excavated about, I believe it's 30 out of 110-ish buildings. And here's a picture of some of the sediments that were preserved in some of these structures. So we actually have intact columns. These are roofing slabs. And we have at least, inside these as dust traps, at least 40 centimeters of deposit. So these are still good places where we can come and look at them, and there's many more left over. I didn't take all of the good ones.
Okay.
You, Paul?
Oh, yeah. Great talk. About the idea that these are larger sites or trade sites or military sites, you said, if they're provisioned, there must have been caravans coming through. Is there anything in the ethnoarchaeology that suggests that the caravanserai are separated from the living area in some way?
I don't see anything in the site structure. And this is actually one thing that I looked at this site. Oh, excuse me. Because the survey work showed that this site actually was also Intermediate Bronze Age. And I was like, okay, what if this is where the people are staying and this is where they keep the animals? We have ample pasture here, especially in the winter. We're not close to water. It's not a great place, but it has a very good commanding view of the landscape. So I thought about that as a possibility, but we just don't seem to have that evidence. There doesn't seem to be anything. Even on the site, we have only one structure that is visibly different, and that one didn't have any finds that indicate anything. Also was excavated by Rudolf Cohen in the 70s and 80s, so I can't really tell you. So, thank you guys.